Something that's been on my mind and really something I want to share with you guys is there's a habitat practice out there that almost all the time is not appropriate for whitetail parcels. Guys that are actually managing, hunters that are managing whitetail parcels, whitetail hunting parcels, and really looking at that habitat that they want to keep for whitetails and improving the best habitat they can for whitetails. And it's a hack and squirt operations, hack and squirt system. It's that idea where you're chopping into the tree and then you're applying a chemical and a herbicide to kill that tree as it dies slowly over time. And you can girdle. Girdling is the same thing. Girdling is a practice where you cut all the way around through the cambium layer of the tree and it dies a slow death, and you can get rid of that tree that way. I've seen some major hack and squirt fails, whitetail habitat fails throughout my travels, and I've seen these consistently. And I just want to give you examples. Northwest Illinois, and I've seen this many times, and this happens to be in Northwest Illinois a lot, Eastern Iowa, in that area. But you're completing a timber harvest, which is great. They're removing all the hardwood, and they're removing a percentage of the hardwood, and they're making a select cut or even a clear cut of that hardwood. And then that next step is to take all the undesirables, which would be maybe soft maple, but certainly box elder, maybe even some type of ash. And they're removing these trees by chopping and squirting and herbiciding these trees, and then they go back in and they plant 700 to 800 hardwoods per acre in tree tubes with the theory and under the guise, and I've had some really upset landowners over this, that it was under the guise that this was going to help their wildlife. And folks, when you're growing hardwood on your property, when you're maintaining hardwood, the worst whitetail property you can find to purchase for whitetails and wildlife, if that's your goal, is a stand of hardwoods. So when you're taking a mixed forest of high and low quality trees, and I'm calling the high quality trees the ones that have the lowest timber value, the low quality trees for wildlife, the hardwoods. When you're cutting out those hardwoods, you're killing the high quality wildlife trees that have great regeneration and feature a lot of food for deer, and that would include aspen, box elder, ash, that great winter food source, fall winter food source that's desperately needed in the whitetail world, and you're just creating more hardwood, then you're creating a pretty poor whitetail parcel. So we'll take this a step further with this situation. Harvest the hardwoods, cut the low quality timber down that's great for wildlife, hack and squirt it so it dies, and then tree tube it, and now you're left with a complete mess. So I've had a landowner that has 15 acres, 30 acres cut like this, and you can't walk through it, deer can't walk through it, and you have to wait 5 to 7 to 8 years for it to break down, for it to actually be usable. And I've seen that on properties in another location where this clear cut they thought was their sanctuary, but no deer can move through it until all this timber breaks down. And we've actually had to take a dozer into those properties and move those piles, move openings, create trails through the mess of, unfortunately destroyed trees by hack and squirt, and then open it up enough so deer can actually walk through there and utilize the space, and hopefully open up the ground so that actually rootstock and the seed bank takes over of trees that are there. That's a major fail I've seen several times, and it's cost a lot of money to reverse, even though they got a lot of money on the front side for the hardwood removal. I'm going to talk about a second one, is central Wisconsin, and a land that I went to a couple times. And in between those two times that I went, there was a back area to the east, and it was full of red oak and aspen. So mixed stand of aspen and red oak. And the thought was that it was explained to the landowner is we're going to girdle and then hack and squirt, whatever it was, destroy all the aspen, and we're going to be left with more acorns. Well, folks, if you have a hardwoods full of acorns and you take out the only good regeneration timber species within that area that can produce side cover and winter browse, because let's face those acorns are very limited time. I came back a couple years later, and now that area of oak and aspen is more open than it ever had been. There was no cover. any deer that were relating to those oaks on a daily basis, or a portion of them, were living on the neighbor's property, because now the deer that were living in that cover with aspen and a higher stem count were pushed off to the neighbors or onto their land, and it produced a park-like effect that, yeah, maybe there's more acorn production, but acorns, hardwoods, doesn't matter if they're maple, if they're oak, if they're cherry, it doesn't really matter. They're not producing really good whitetail cover, and that wasn't the case in there. So that person was left with, if he wanted to improve that area, he had to actually cut down a higher percentage of oaks now to get that hardwood regeneration. And let's face it, you know, hinge cutting is not something you need to use on every parcel. And sometimes people say, well, hack and squirt is better than hinge cutting, or hinge cutting is better than hack and squirt. It's not like that. It's what fits for the land. If you're trying to produce high dollar timber and you don't really care about the wildlife and whitetails, then a hack and squirt. Just produce timber, raise timber. But I don't know how many of you out there bought your land to produce timber. And if you have a large area that you need to worry about that timber production, for me personally, I would actually sell that hardwood parcel and then buy something that was a lot more diverse, even if it was smaller. So you have to think about those balances of what you're doing to the woods. In that case, that landowner had to cut a lot of oak down. If it was mature oak, he could harvest it. If it was middle-aged oak, he just needed to get the shade down. I would cut the leaners, cut the weak. Not every oak tree is a good oak tree, even in a good oak stand. And then finally, if there were oaks that were in that 6-8 inch range and you could hinge cut them, then that might be viable. Hinge cutting can be maintained for decades. Don't let someone tell you it's just a 2 or 3 year thing. Those shoots that come off the side of the hinge cut, you can go back in and hinge cut those again in 5 years. You can tie the saplings down if you want, but it's all about producing that side cover and food and that regeneration. And that's the idea of hinge cutting, if it's appropriate for your parcel, which it is usually 20-25% of the time on most parcels. And you can create a great mess of side cover and regeneration with hinge cuts. And in that case, with that central Wisconsin landowner, I truly felt bad for him, because now he was left to cut down. He was misled that this would be a good wildlife area, and don't let that happen to you. Now, a Southern Michigan client, friend of mine, I consider. I've been to his property several times to help cut and shape his property. His name's Frank, great guy. Really enjoyed working with him. What I felt bad with Frank is, for one, he had a lot of habitat things he paid for that weren't really working with him. Small bedding areas that were just canopy produced and didn't affect the overall cover of the land enough to hold deer. And deer didn't use them too much during the fall and winter. Great summer canopy, the trampoline effect for shade. But he had a food plot that was in the center of his land, and they girdled giant poplar trees on the sunny side, on the south side, to remove canopy. And so then over the next 3 or 4 years, those poplar died and would fall down, created a giant mess in that area. And when he was out on his tractor working one day, he was extremely lucky that one of those poplar ended up falling right next to his tractor. An open cab tractor. It would have killed him if it fell on him. So very dangerous practice, for one, because you don't know when they're going to fall down. And I have experienced that deer avoid those areas. They're not stupid. They know that cracking, creaking. They know what that means. They know that they're not supposed to bed in there. But what a wasted resource. Poplar or aspen, some of the most important tree species in the woods that you can cut and experience 7,000 shoots per acre that grouse love, that rabbits love to hide in, and oh yes, deer love to feed in them and use cover. So it's one of the most important species for wildlife, and I've seen hack and squirt jobs on aspen or poplar throughout the country in the north half where you experience those trees, and what an incredible waste. I saw one, and this isn't related necessarily to hacking and squirting or girdling, but northern Wisconsin clients had about 160 acres. They had 155 acres of hardwood. They had a stand of aspen, and the forester actually recommended get rid of the aspen. This will help your wildlife, and we'll tree tube 700 hardwoods per acre in that location. I'm there 5 to 8 years later because nothing's working, and those trees are all dead. And that pile of aspen that they destroyed the lateral root system and killed, and that berm is off to the side. And what a shame, because that was really the only whitetail habitat that they had out of that 160 acres. So felt bad for them, but that's not much different than what we're talking here. In Frank's case, they could have cut that aspen down, they could have timber harvested the aspen, but at the very least they could have just cut it down, and they could have cleaned it up so that deer could utilize it, bed in it, other wildlife could use it, maybe get some grouse on his property. But that was a huge wasted resource, and it all went back to that girdling. It could have been hack and squirt, wouldn't have really mattered, but a big failure when it came to managing the wildlife on his property. And folks, don't get me wrong, all of these people I'm talking about, they own their property purely for wildlife. They were upset at these practices years later because they didn't realize how much it hurt them when it came to wildlife. I'm going to talk about another thing, and this is more of a general with hack and squirt. A lot of hack and squirt activities produce incredible summer herbaceous growth. You get briars and weeds, and in like an early successional field, a fallow field that gets taken over, in 20-25 years there might be enough cover, 15 years, whatever it takes, to actually hold deer on there and produce that upland type feel. And when you're hacking and squirting in the woods and you're getting rid of a lot of times the wrong timber, the wrong wildlife species, you're actually killing it instead of cutting it down, harvesting it, hinge cutting it if appropriate, and getting that side cover and food and hardwood regeneration. And that's what it boils down to. If you're creating summer herbaceous growth, which deer have 5 times more than they need in most locations of the whitetail world during the summertime, you're just adding more food that they already have on top of food that they already have. And so that's not accomplishing anything. And because all that summer food that they love dies during the fall and winter. So then the deer have no cover, it lays down flat, and they have no food. Yes, eventually it'll turn into something. But if you went in those areas and you remove the timber and let it grow, regenerate naturally out of the stump or root system in the case of the aspen or the poplar, or if you hinge cut it if appropriate, and you get that side sprouting, and you don't want to hinge cut at head high because then there's no cover at deer level and they have no food at deer level. So don't watch that head high. It's kind of ridiculous and dangerous, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody on this planet. You don't want to do that. I've heard of too many horror stories of chains getting wrapped around people's necks, and not to mention you're putting food and cover up here. Deer are 3 feet tall. So put that food down at their level if you're going to hinge cut. But bottom line, you can put some cool pictures on Instagram, maybe even make a YouTube video about it, and say, look at all this great herbaceous growth I'm making during the summertime. The deer even eat it. You put a trail camera on it. What'd you accomplish? You probably removed fall and winter potential cover and fall and winter potential food, and if you did it at the expense of that fall and winter when deer need it the most, you really not only didn't help the deer herd at all, but you didn't make your property any more attractive when it matters most, when you can actually build, mold, and shape a deer herd. And let's face it, I'll end with this. A lot of times when you hear hack and squirt, just think of timber production right away. Because if you're creating summer forage, you're not doing much. If you're destroying high quality wildlife species trees like box elder or aspen, poplar, and ash even, and the list can go on from there depending on your area and depending on your habitat, then you're really destroying a valuable resource as it relates to your herd and hunting goals and even building a herd. Because if your property is not at maximum attraction for the fall and winter related habitat that whitetails and wildlife need, then you're really not accomplishing much in the whitetail woods. And so I want you to be very wary of these practices and very wary of having them done on your land, because like in the case of several of my clients, stretched out dozens of clients over many years, then very expensive to correct. You've wasted a huge resource that could have helped you along the way. And when you hear hack and squirt, think timber production, think timber harvest, think hardwood production, and it really, the majority of the time, is not going to be a very appropriate fit for your land, especially when you're trying to create a great whitetail herd and hunt. And I want you to take a look at what's behind me right here. And this is an example of a hack and squirt or girdling without actually completing those practices. Unfortunately, I first saw the emerald ash borer at least 8, 10, 12 years ago. I don't know when it struck Michigan, but basically in Michigan now, every ash tree here is gone, and it was gone years ago. And incredible wasted resource. And I want you to see I'm leaning against an ash tree right here, and we started noticing the emerald ash borer here. I first noticed it in Wisconsin, in O'Connell Falls area. It was probably about 8 years ago, and you know, after Michigan. And then over here in southwest Wisconsin now, I saw the emerald ash borer last year. Even took a picture, showed it to the landowner here. I felt really bad that they're coming through, but it's inevitable. This is not that much different than a hack and squirt or girdling operation, because this tree is dying as it stands right here. It's dying a slow death over a year. A great use of the resource is you could actually cut this tree down, harvest it before the emerald ash borer. There's some places that are taking trees when the ash borer is going through. But bottom line, you could have cut this incredible stump sprouts that deer love during the fall and winter, and it would have been a great resource before this happens. There's still some life in the tree, so you can still create that by cutting this down, and we might do this in this location. There's a few ash trees and junk around here that's great for whitetails, and get a lot of stems out of these, a lot of regeneration. And guess what? It takes about 7, 8 years for the emerald ash borer to be able to get into that ash tree, because it's a smooth bark until that time. Once the bark develops where the emerald ash borer can bore into the tree, it makes that D-sized hole. It looks like chips. You can see this one's pretty far gone. There's some that are less around me. But there's a thought that if you keep it young and in that state with that ash, that the emerald ash borer move on. There's a period of incubation, and then you'll actually have viable ash trees on your land. So I encourage you, if you have ash trees, to cut them down. And it's no different than girdling or hack and squirt. It's a great wildlife tree, produces great regeneration. And I want you to think about what you're doing with your trees and your timber and how it relates to your wildlife. And if you're bought your property to manage timber, that's awesome. Hack and squirt might be for you. But if you like whitetails and wildlife, I'd personally stay away from hack and squirt whitetail activities, or maybe you'll be on the next hack and squirt fail list that we do next year or the year after.